And without any further ado, we'll go ahead and Dr. Wooten, it's up to you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you all for having me here. The drive was quite pleasant. I left the snow in Franklin, so I don't guess y'all got any of that coming down here. No, it was quite pretty when I left Middle Tennessee, and then it started melting on the way down. Get to Pulaski, there was nothing there. So thank you all, and Mr. Thompson, thank you. I'm sorry I was tardy trying to get here, but
No, you're fine.
as I was telling him earlier, I said, you know, I had all my speaking engagements in 2020 got canceled last year like the rest of the world. So it's really good to be out on this book tour again, you know. So I finished, this was an 8-year project. It came out of my PhD, my dissertation. I started this research in 2011 and finished it in 2019, and I ended up publishing the book at the end of that year in December of 2019. So I missed all, like I said, I missed all of 2020 to get that promotion, so I'm really glad to be out here. Did a little bit at the tail end of last year, and I've got a lot set up for this year. So it was a wonderful drive down. It wasn't that far. I thought it was a lot further, but it's really only about 2.5 hours from Nashville. Nice drive, pretty drive. But tonight I'm going to talk to you about a few things. I'm going to talk to you how the book came about, why I decided to do a book on this fantastic story. I'm going to be skipping around a lot. Normally, when I give this presentation, I start explaining why Johnsonville existed while it was there. And tonight, I'm going to go a little bit different, a little bit backwards. I might need one of those. Yeah, perfect, yes. I'm going to go in a little bit more tonight on some of the Confederate actions that took place that resulted in what became the Battle of Johnsonville, which was late in the war. I'm not too big on standing behind podiums for an hour, so forgive me if I start roaming around the room. That's generally how I like to do it.
That's good.
But this is just to kind of put you in sequence of what's going on at this time of the war, is the North Alabama campaign we're familiar with has ended. That concludes in September of 1864, at the end of September. In October, they go into camp. They're at Cherokee Station, not too far from here. Eventually, they end up in Corinth, again, on the outskirts of Corinth. And they begin what's called the West Tennessee Campaign. It would be Forrest's 4th campaign in the West Tennessee. And these campaigns, just so you'll know, they were always for seeking supplies, trying to get new recruits, and especially trying to get mounts, because at this time of the war, especially toward the end, a lot of these infantry battalions, and especially some at this point even division size, not all divisions were being mounted, but a lot of these regiments were. And a lot of the infantry regiments that are with Forrest at this time of this campaign are mounted, and they're serving as mounted infantry. So that means they're still trained as infantry, but they're fighting on horseback. And a lot of times they would dismount. You'd have horse holders in the rear of where they were fighting. Mr. Gregg, we were talking about Richland Creek just a few minutes ago. At the Battle of Richland Creek, they did that. They dismounted and they fought like infantry. But here at Johnsonville, this campaign, I learned one thing when I wrote this book. It's a convoluted mess. Just like most Civil War battles, you think of Shiloh, you think that was a confused mess. I'm going to try to make sense out of this for all of you tonight. And I'm going to skip around a little bit. Like I said, I normally start from explaining why there was a depot and getting into that, but sometimes you get kind of lost in that, and I don't save enough time to get to the actual battle that took place and some of the troops that were engaged. So I'm going to start with that. So where we are, it's early October. They're in camp. Most of you, I'm sure, have read up on Forrest. You know, one of my favorite books in the world is this one, Campaigns of Nathan Bedford Forrest by Jordan Pryor. I'm sure y'all may be familiar with that.
I like the 2 authors.
The authors were good. Yeah, they did a really good job writing this. You know, they were not writing with Forrest, but they were absent. You know, there were correspondents that met with the actual participants after the war. So, you know, it's not a primary source, but it really is because it was taken directly from those participants. So the information in here is really good. They go in quite a bit to the North Alabama campaign, the Sulphur Creek Trestle Battle, Athens, and then they move into this campaign, Pulaski. So what I'm going to do tonight is, like I said, I'm going to be skipping around a little bit, and I'm going to come back to Johnsonville. So it's October, it's 1864. Keep in mind that at this stage in the Civil War, as much as I hate to say it, the Confederacy is losing the war, and they're losing badly. You know, at this point, Sherman's grand war machine is at full force, and he's moving through Georgia. As a result of this campaign, Sherman would kick off his famous Georgia to the Sea march, you know, from when he left Atlanta and made his swath towards Savannah. You may be familiar with White's book, That Devil Forest.
Yep.
Well, that title comes directly from a quote that was said by General William Tecumseh Sherman as a result of the Johnsonville campaign. There's a continuation of that quote. That devil forest, ... was down around Johnsonville wreaking havoc on those damn gunboats.
Right.
It was a little bit too long for a title of a book, but that's where Sherman was going at with that quote. And because of that, 1 week later, he launches on November the 10th his campaign to the sea. So I think in a lot of ways, this speaks a lot of volumes over what was happening, not just in Tennessee and North Alabama and this region of the Western Theater, but the Confederates needed a victory. And all of a sudden, you have this tactical victory right here on the Tennessee River late in the war, and the Confederate leadership is going, well, wait a minute, what's going on? You know, Forrest is still out here kicking butt in the Western Theater. So this happens really late. Unfortunately, they needed a strategic victory. This was a tactical victory. Strategically, it was too late. Now, maybe if this campaign would have occurred a year before, they could have gained some tread with that. But at this stage, the war would be over 6 months later. It did end up being General Forrest's most successful raid of the war. After the result of what happened at Johnsonville, the estimates were somewhere around the $8 million mark in damages. You know, today that would probably be close to about $940 million in damages. Almost $1 billion of what unfolded at Johnsonville. So before I get into that, I had a few reasons why I wanted to do this book. Besides being the manager at the park and living there and being consumed with that environment every day, I found out real quickly there wasn't a book on Johnsonville. There had been one written by Colonel Steenburn. I believe you've got a copy of it there. It's a good book. However, Colonel Steenburn did not go into a lot of the details of the Union Depot itself, why it was there, what was going on.
Yeah.
So that's the question that I wanted to answer is like, why would this depot suddenly pop up between the middle of Fort Donelson and Shiloh on the Tennessee River? You know, everybody that comes to Tennessee to visit Civil War sites, they were heading to Fort Donelson and they skipped down the river to Shiloh and then head on over to Chickamauga, and we're passing this grand story right here on the Tennessee River. I'm from this area, I grew up there. I'm from Humphreys County where this unfolded. So this was always in my psyche. It was always there, like asking these questions. Why is this fantastic story not being told? And it is one. So this became the subject of my dissertation. And I had to come back to my advisors with, you know, especially in your second year study of what you're going to write about. And being a Civil War historian, having that background, having worked at a number of historic sites, all Civil War related, it just kind of made sense that this story needed to be written the way that it needed to be told. And that wasn't just from the Confederate point of view, which had been told multiple times through the years through issues of Confederate Veteran Magazine, multiple periodicals on the war. But there was also a side of Johnsonville that was missing, which was the Union side. There was also an African American story there. There was a lot of United States colored troops that were stationed at the depot eventually. So you had this convoluted garrison there made up of Navy personnel, Army personnel, civilians, United States colored troops.
you had Teamsters there, you had civilian employees working for the quartermaster's department. So you had all these operations happening within a 90-acre compound right here on the banks of the Tennessee River. Some of the slides I'm about to show you will explain that. One of the things that changed the course of my research was I was down in the park one day. I think I was there by myself, which was regular. We were often on the riverbanks down there alone. And this guy drove up in a Chevy Tahoe, and he put his window down and said, "Hey, you work here?" I'm like, "Yeah." I had a uniform on. And he said, "Hey, I had an ancestor that was here. He was at Johnsonville, he was stationed. He was in a Wisconsin unit." And I was like, "Wow, really?" And it's just being the Civil War historian, bells go off. And he said, "Hey, and by the way," he reached into the back seat, he goes, "I've got all of his letters here, 402 of them. Could y'all use anything with that?" And of course, being a historian, y'all are historians, you know how valuable primary source material is.
Start drooling right there.
It just fell into my lap. It truly did that day on the side of the road in Johnson. We were talking about Richland Creek just a few minutes ago. At the Battle of Richland Creek, they did that. They dismounted and they fought like infantry. But here at Johnsonville, this campaign, I learned one thing when I wrote this book. It's a convoluted mess. Just like most Civil War battles, after the result of what happened at Johnsonville, the estimates were somewhere around the $8 million mark in damages. Today that would probably be close to about $940 million in damages. Almost $1 billion of what unfolded at Johnsonville. So before I get into that, I had a few reasons why I wanted to do this book. Besides being the manager at the park and living there and being consumed with that environment every day, I found out real quickly there wasn't a book on Johnsonville. There had been one written by Colonel Steenburn. I believe you've got a copy of it there. It's a good book. However, Colonel Steenburn did not go into a lot of the details of the Union Depot itself, why it was there, what was going on.
Yeah.
So that's the question that I wanted to answer is like, why would this depot suddenly pop up between the middle of Fort Donelson and Shiloh on the Tennessee River? The corporal of Company F of the 43rd Wisconsin, who was the main garrison at Johnsonville. I finally had the hook that I needed to tell the story from within the inside of the depot. Nobody knew what was going on inside, really, until these letters surfaced. And with those letters were, now I'll pass these around. These are copies of the letters right here. But within the letters, Atwood begins describing buildings and where corrals are located. You can see, even did hand-drawn maps telling his wife that I live in barracks number C. The railroad's to my left. The wharf, the depot wharf, is 100 yards to our front.
Wow.
So this gave us a geographical location of how the place looked. And from that, into the book, I was able to come up with 180 buildings were eventually constructed there within a 90-acre compound. And like I said, I'll pass these around. Lorenzo is this man right here. This is a pre-Civil War, and you can see them closer in a minute. A pre-Civil War photograph of he and his son Arthur. When we had the 150th anniversary of Johnsonville in 2014, Arthur's son, who came to the event, the 150th anniversary, was 97 years old. And he came there with the man that I received the letters from and his sister. So the kid that's in this photograph, it's taken about 1859. I'm meeting his grandfather, who eventually is how I got to this story.
Wow.
So the hook for the book was Lorenzo Atwood's telling of the battle and everything going on inside. The other hook to the story is what came out of Jordan Pryor and some other primary sources that I was able to locate of men who was riding directly with Mabry's brigade and Chalmers' division, talking about the stuff that was unfolding on the opposite side of the river. So I had a way to finally tell the story from the Confederate side and the Union side, and I also had accounts from Navy personnel that had never been unheard of. Growing up, on that river, you'd always heard about the Battle of Fort Donelson and the ironclads and the battle that took place there right on the banks of the Cumberland River. I soon learned out that little battle didn't hold a candle to what unfolded at Johnsonville with the gunboat battle that took place those 2 days. So here we are, it's West Tennessee. They begin moving into West Tennessee October the 16th. This campaign, his 4th campaign, they basically rally in Jackson, Tennessee, with the anticipation and orders of his superior, Force's superior, General Richard Taylor, to move into West Tennessee for these primary reasons. And I'm going to be reading a few things out of my book tonight. The first thing was to repair railroads. So part of this campaign, and this was upon Force's suggestions, was to repair the railroads into West Tennessee, vital for transporting men and supplies. These repairs, he urged, should commence immediately on the Memphis and Charleston Railroad from Cherokee, Alabama to Corinth, Mississippi, which were in pathetic, pitiful shape. The Mobile and Ohio Railroad from Bethel to Jackson would be completed and better protect Hood's army as it moved into Middle Tennessee. So Hood's campaign had been planned. Remember, at this time of the war, he's making his push into Middle Tennessee. So as a feint movement, as a diversion, Force moves back into West Tennessee to counter the movements of Hood that's moving up from the south. Now, I told you got to hang with me. This gets really confusing. Number 2, second part of Force's plan involved 2 coordinated movements into West Tennessee by his 1st Division Commander, James Chalmers, and his 2nd Division Commander, Abraham Buford. Buford would ride north from Corinth to Lexington, Tennessee, and from there eventually end up at Paris, where they would go to Paris Landing, which today is on the Tennessee River. It's also, that part of the river is called the Kentucky Reservoir, Kentucky Lake. And that site is underwater today, but as you cross the bridge over the lake today, you can look to your right and you can see the point of Fort Hyman, where eventually they rode 5 miles into Kentucky and occupied. And I'll show you those slides coming up in just a minute. And thirdly, Force's plan involved gathering new recruits, horses, and food for another campaign for these troops. You got to remember, since they were losing the war, they were trying to prolong the war. And to be able to prolong the war, that meant you needed recruits and especially mounts. And trying to find healthy horses at that stage in the war, West Tennessee and Western Kentucky had been pilfered for 3 years, mainly by Union forces. So imagine trying to find available mounts in October and November of 1864.
Yeah, even a mule.
Mules, yeah, there were mules, and a lot of his men actually were mounted on mules. The 3rd Kentucky, who was riding with Buford, were all on mules.
Yeah.
So you got any kind of basically a horse of some type was going to be found if it could. All right, so and again, I'm going to go through just real quickly here. There's Forrest. That's the last photograph he took. That was taken in February of second to last. That's taken in February of 1864. If you look at his collar, he's still a major general at that location. He eventually becomes a lieutenant general in 1865.
Yeah.
And there's one more photo that's taken of the general, and then that's the one where his beard is gray. You can tell the war takes quite a toll at that point.
Yeah, I like that one too, though.
I just covered some of the reasons why he's going into this region once again. This is James Chalmers. Now at this point, Chalmers, as part of this movement, leaving Corinth, is dispatched to Memphis, Tennessee. There's about 7,000 federal troops in Memphis at that time. Chalmers only has about 500 men. Through this whole campaign, Forrest only has, including artillery, Morton's artillery, about 3,100 troops. That's it. And he's going up against, you know, he's always outnumbered at this point in the war. So Chalmers is operating around Memphis purposely as a feint movement, once again a diversionary. So all of a sudden he's attacking outposts at Memphis. Well, that's drawing the attention away from the western end. So while that's going on, he orders Buford from Corinth to move north to Lexington, and they rally at a place called Jack's Creek, just outside of Jackson, Tennessee, where they shoe their horses for about 10 days. So all 3,100 eventually end up rallying there before they head to the Tennessee River. And on the 28th of October, Buford's lead troops end up on the Tennessee River at Paris Landing. 2 days later, he's followed on the 30th by General Chalmers and eventually Forrest with his escort, which is Rucker's Brigade, Alabama Rucker, who follows him with about 40 men. At that point, Forrest's escort's really small. It's about 40 people. So they all eventually end up at the Tennessee River. And I'll go through, there's the brigade commanders, McCullough and Mabry, who's with Chalmers. There's Rucker on the left, and then David Kelly with the 7th Tennessee Cavalry is also with Forrest. There's Abraham Buford. He's one of my favorite, not only Confederate soldiers, but division commanders in the whole war.
Yeah, mine too. He was tough.
Tough guy.
Yeah.
Tyree Bell is probably my favorite there on the right.
Yeah, he was more than tough. He was a good strategist too.
They sure were.
Bell.
So in Buford's division, you got 2 brigade commanders. You got Highland Lyon, who's a brigadier general at that point, and you've got Tyree Bell. So Forrest is, yeah, you're right. This laptop has a life of its own, doesn't it?
Captain Morton.
So John Morton, who's 23 years old at this time of this engagement, you know, he's a young man, and he's got a big responsibility. In February of 1864, Forrest gives him entire command of his artillery.
Yeah.
He eventually writes a book 20 years after the war called My Life of Nathan Bedford Forrest, Morton's Artillery. I own a first edition of that I found in a back of a bookstore in Georgia. The guy had no idea what he had.
Wow.
Unfortunately, it wasn't signed by Morton, but it was a first edition. It was published in 1890, so it's almost 30 years after the war. But he's recollecting what's going on out of this campaign. Anyway, Morton plays a really big role in this battle and the entire campaign because during the Johnsonville, West Tennessee expedition, they had suffered some of the worst weather in the entire war. It had rained incessantly for 3 weeks. Every road, the rivers were swollen. The Tennessee was especially swollen, but most of the roads were impassable. And Morton, just like most artillerymen in the Civil War, were dependent usually on teams of just 2 horses, pulling a caisson, a limber. Generally at that time it was just a limber. Some of the caissons were still remaining, but most of it was just limber and then the gun. Through these roads, through these muddy roads. As they moved down from Paris Landing eventually towards Johnsonville, which is 40 miles, they were basically having to cut themselves through the woods, cut roads through the woods to make it a passable terrain. So, as they move into Fort Hyman, I took that in, my slides are cut off there. I took that, I think, 2 years ago. The Park Service owns that site now. Fort Hyman is just over the border in Kentucky. If you've never been up there, it's fantastic. But the original earthworks are still there. Buford's men would have occupied those works on October the 29th. And what they're going to do is try to intercept transport traffic working between Paducah and Johnsonville. So it's 242 miles, nautical miles, between Muscle Shoals and Paducah. So you've got naval bases, major federal naval bases at Muscle Shoals, Johnsonville in the middle, and then Paducah. So that's how they're controlling the Tennessee River. So, and you gotta remember, in naval terminology, when you're talking about a boat moving south, it's going upriver. If it's going north, it's going downriver.
Yeah.
So as they're occupying Fort Hyman, as Buford's men are inside Fort Hyman, one of these transport boats heading upriver, heading toward Johnsonville from Paducah, comes through a trap that they set up. And the trap is artillery under Morton and about 700 infantrymen kind of pickled along the riverbank. One of these boats come through, they let it pass. The second boat comes through, which is a transport boat known as the Mazeppa, gets fired on. Actually, the firing is so accurate by Morton's men, who use a 20-pound Parrott gun that they captured at Union City, that they knocked the steam pipes off of the Mazeppa, cut it right in half. I can't, imagine a gunner concealed low on the river. Think about that, the skill that it took to cut the steam pipe of one of those boats, just cut it right off.
Yeah.
Morton talks about that in his book.
And it was moving at the time.
It's moving.
Yeah.
They go to full steam and full panic. The Mazeppa is not able to pass the gunners. The pilot ends up beaching the boat on the eastern side of the riverbank. The crew flees into the woods. They capture the boat. They run a hawser and a line across the river and pull the boat back over to the western side. This is the biggest Christmas present they could ever ask for, because it was chock full of supplies: food, shoes, clothing, furniture, candles, everything that was going to be used at the depot at Johnsonville. Are you following me? So that's boat number one. So they stay here for the next few days, wreaking havoc on all these transport boats moving between Paducah and Johnsonville. 40 miles, so about a 40-mile distance. Just to make this a little shorter, you'll follow me here. So you've got the federal transport Anna, which escapes the Confederate guns at Fort Hyman, and it's heading north. The Anna, escaping the Confederate guns, is one of the primary reasons why the Confederates end up into a fight at Johnsonville. They're able to get back to Paducah and warn Leroy Fitch, who's the commander of the Western Fleet flotilla, to say, hey, Confederates are down at Fort Hyman, old Confederate Fort Hyman. They've occupied it. They're stopping riverboat traffic. We got a big problem. So the last thing that Forrest wanted to be up against ever, because he experienced it at Shiloh, and he talks about it, under the Lexington and Tyler being bombarded all night. And he even said, had troops ever been under the fire of gunboats, it would change their life. Because, they were firing these big, massive beer keg type shells into lines that would explode and caused a lot of havoc on Confederates, especially at Shiloh. So Forrest understood this, and that's the last thing he wanted to come underneath, was a flotilla of 8 gunboats broadsiding the riverbank. And one of those guns, I think, most of them were tin clads, which are transports that were basically converted transports that had you just think of a aluminum soda can. That's about as thin as the sheeting was. A mini ball could easily penetrate that. So they got this metal sheeting on the outside, usually with 4 Seacoast artillery guns facing whatever direction. You had 8 on the ship, and you had 1 on the bow end, and you had 1 on the stern end. So you had 10 guns generally on these tin clads. So Forrest knew that if they were caught in these river bottoms where they couldn't move, that they would be destroyed before they even got to the Johnsonville area. Very quickly, so on the 30th, the USS Undine, which is a federal gunboat, and through this entire campaign, there's 4 federal boats: the USS Undine, the Tarawa, the Elfin, and then the Key West. Those are 4 gunboats owned directly by the U.S. Navy. All the other boats engaged in this conflict are transport boats that are owned by civilian operators.
Yeah.
Okay? So this kind of goes into that convoluted mess I was telling you about. So you've got boats being captured, boats escaping, all kinds of stuff going on around Fort Hyman. All right, there's a photo map, TVA map that shows the bridge crossing Kentucky Lake.
Is that one made about, the one that CA made about 1940, showed the Confederate position?
Maybe this thing has
Sometime in the 1940s,
a lot of times these will have a pointer on it.
Those look like the 1960s.
1960s.
Actually.
Yeah, it does.
Well, I thought maybe it'd have a little laser pointer, but this is the
It might be in that book.
Big Sandy River.
Yeah, 1974.
If you look right here, that is the original channel of the Tennessee River before the reservoir was made. Right in here, there was one of the boats that it's actually sunk right in the middle of the channel. If you go on past the bridge, Fort Hyman, just to put you in perspective, would be up here. There's Highway 79 today. When you're over there, you can see all of this. But the transport boat Cheeseman, which is one of the boats that they end up scuttling and sinking at the foot of the Big Sandy River, which would have been right here, it's out there. It's in about 30 feet of water. I was involved as manager of Johnsonville with 4 underwater archaeological dives onto those boats. I wasn't diving, but I was out there. They recovered a lot of artifacts off of that boat, as well as some of the other wrecks down at Johnsonville. This campaign produced more inland river naval wrecks than any other campaign or battle of the Civil War. They're still out there. The section between Paducah, Kentucky and Muscle Shoals, Alabama, that 242 nautical mile stretch, has more inland river Civil War wrecks than anywhere else in the country.
Really?
Even more than the Missouri River with the packet boats. And these are from military operations. One of those was the USS Eclipse that blew up accidentally from a boiler explosion on, well, we're almost there, January 27th, 1865, about 2 months after this battle. It's still out there in about 15 feet of water. To my knowledge and research, there's not a photograph of the Undine, but that's the sister ship to the Undine, which is the USS Nymph. And that's number 54. The Undine was gunboat number 55. I wish my slides were not running off y'all are missing a lot of wordage up there. Well,
Doctor, what, you want me to try to get you a pad like that?
hold that thought. They're still north of Johnsonville, about 40 miles. They're wreaking havoc on this campaign up around Paris Landing, capturing gunboats, transport boats. As a result, they captured the Undine and the transport boat Venus. And there's only one other time in military history where cavalry and infantry forces used naval guns to assault an opposing force, and that was in the Crimea War in 1856. No other time has this ever happened, and it did not happen to anything that I was able to find, at least, in the Civil War. This was the first time that you've got a coordinated movement between land troops and cavalry. They use the boats. They redevise this plan while they're up there. This happens on November the 1st, that they're going to approach Johnsonville with half the force mounted with, I'd love to see this. Imagine, just picture that. 100 mounts walking across a gangplank to mount these boats, these transport boats, down in the cargo holds. They're on their mounts. They got their horses. On the shore was Morton and Chalmers' division, followed by Buford's division in the rear. They had it pretty tough. They're the ones that were trying to pull those guns through the river muck. And a lot of these bottoms, if you've been along we live here, y'all are on the Tennessee River. As you get up into Tennessee on the Tennessee, it's a lot of bottom land up there. It's real muddy. I grew up in that environment. In December, when duck hunting started, into November, if you didn't have muck boots, you weren't going to make it out there. All right, so you got the Union forces. There's the big commanders, of course, Sherman and Thomas. Thomas is in Nashville at that point.
Yeah.
General Thomas is, of course, the commander of the Army of the Cumberland. And Sherman's operating He's basically in charge of all federal operations in the Western Theater at this point. So he's the big dog, as they might say. Now, I was very fortunate during the research to find, I looked everywhere. I tried to find, first I uncovered the name of the commander at Johnsonville. He was another young guy, just like Morton. It was 23-year-old Charles Thompson. He was colonel of the 12th United States Colored Troops. How many of you have seen that movie, Glory, with Matthew Broderick? It's a great movie. This is exactly what's going on in Glory. You got a young 24-year-old guy who's been an officer under Rosecrans. He promoted through the ranks all the way up from Shiloh. He actually fought at the Battle of Belmont as a young lieutenant. By this stage, he's given command of a black regiment, a United States Colored Troop regiment, the 12th United States Colored Troop. So he's the colonel that somehow ends up at Johnsonville. He was never ordered there. I never found anything that showed where he was ordered to go to Johnsonville. But somehow he ends up there around the time that Forrest is leaving Corinth, around October 16th. Atwood speaks about him in his letters. It's quite detailed. I'm pretty sure this is Acting Volunteer Lieutenant Edward King. So you had a naval commander and you had an army commander at Johnsonville. You had two people that were in charge of both of those forces. I did learn one thing, that these two men hated each other's guts completely.
Wow.
Imagine that, an army guy not getting along with a Navy guy, right? So King, of course, he's the commandant of the USS Key West that will play a role in just a second. There's the Johnsonville garrison, about 2,200 men, that's about it. So
43rd Wisconsin.
here you have a case late in the Civil War where you've got Confederate troops outnumbering the garrison at Johnsonville. So you can see right there, probably about 400. I don't think I have the naval person on there. You can add the Navy. You can add about 400 Navy personnel onto that. But you can see what you've got there. You've got 1st Kansas Battery, 2nd Tennessee Mounted, a lot of USCT troops, about 500, and then the main garrison, which is where Atwood belongs, he's a member of, is the 43rd Wisconsin.
Go back just real quick. Do you know the exact companies of the 2nd Tennessee Mounted? We got.
I
the
do.
reason there's like 5 of us that have ancestors from the 2nd Tennessee.
I do, and it's in the book. I can't recall exactly which companies are there. There's about 4. This is one of the members in the 43rd. It's what they look like, which I was surprised because late in the war, a lot of Sherman's troops are being issued these 4-button sack coats. Well, there's so much, you gotta keep in mind, there's so much surplus for these troops that are in the rear with the gear, as they might say, at the depot, that they're still wearing and being issued these 1860 and 1861 military frock coats. I mean, this picture is taken of Bushnell in Nashville in September of 1864. So that tells us a lot right there. You can look at some of his equipment. That model that he's holding is a second model of an 1863 Springfield. So they have, some of the earlier troops were using 61s, but that's a 63. And he actually brought the musket into the visitor center one day. I got to hold that musket. Now, how cool is that? And it was probably fired at a Confederate at the Battle of Johnsonville that day, on November the 4th.
Hey, Dr. Wood, did you obtain that by the paper collection that fell?
This was another.
Here you found it somewhere else.
This was another ancestor that, we have people coming to the park all the time that had ancestors that were garrisoned, that were part of the garrison at Johnsonville. This was one of him. Bushnell, aside Atwood, they were in different companies, but they were still in the same regiment. During my tenure there as manager, I had, I'd say, 6 ancestors of veterans that were there. Almost all of them were the 43rd Wisconsin and the 2nd Tennessee. those are the officers of the garrison. That picture is taken in Nashville after the battle. There's a better picture of Lorenzo Atwood. I apologize, I meant to pass that around. That's the letters and his wife.
That picture's in the book.
I don't want to, it is in the book, it's in the front. I don't want to spoil the book. Because number one, I do want you to buy the book.
Yeah.
And number two, there is a sad connection to this, like so many Civil War stories.
Yeah.
His wife and his daughter are left home in Wisconsin. He never sees them again. They contracted diphtheria, and they die from that fall. His son is with his mother and his daughter, who's 10 years old. Can you imagine? And and I've seen the letter. It's in the collection that I came about with the ancestor that owns those letters. His 10-year-old son writes his dad, who's in the Army. He doesn't know any of this. That's how he finds out. He finds out that his wife and daughter are dead from this disease back at the farm in Wisconsin from a handwritten letter by a 10-year-old out on the farm. And just looking at that letter, written by a 10-year-old, beds on one side and masonry chimneys on the other. So we use that description, and we constructed 4 of these in the park. And when you go there, constructed at Johnsonville that I came up, finally figured out, they would have had to construct the sawmill first. We do know they kept records. They produced over 400,000 board feet of lumber. 400,000 board feet.
A lot of feet.
Yeah.
I don't, honestly, I've done some minor woodworking at home. I can't even tell you what that even is. What is 400,000 square board feet? It's a lot of wood.
Yeah, it is.
All right, so this is a wartime drawing of what it eventually ended up being. So to picture in your mind what a supply depot is in the Western Theater in the Civil War, it's a very agrarian, utilitarian space that generally included loading ramps, railroads, a turntable to turn trains around that were coming on one track from Nashville. And a turntable is basically where a train would pull onto a rotating arm, and underneath it men would turn the steam engine back in the direction of Nashville. Then it would back down the tracks to 2 warehouses right here. You can see the track, and that's where they would load the supplies. The wharf at Johnsonville was massive. It was 600 yards long, 6 football fields.
Wow.
If you go to Nashville today and you're standing down there on First Avenue, that wharf is about 300 yards, so twice the size of that. It was macadamized, which means it had a surface of crushed stone that was impacted on the side. It's still out there today. In just a minute, I'll show you that photograph, but you can actually wade out there and stand on those stones. It's only about waist deep. Yes, I'm crazy enough to do that in the Tennessee River. So there were two forts, redoubts, however you want to say it. The lower redoubt is the one to the left. My good friend David Meager, he lives just over the border in Alabama from Pulaski, just a few miles south. But he's a naval artist. He is fantastic. He does a lot of the drawing. He did all the drawings in my book. He did these early, 1991 and 92. But these are really good depictions of what those fortifications look like. So there were some pretty significant fortifications inside the 90-acre compound used for defense of the place. They're still there. I argue all day long they're probably some of the most immaculately preserved earthworks in Tennessee that I've seen. I've worked in Virginia. Petersburg's got some pretty monstrous earthworks. But I think as far as Tennessee, they've been basically sitting under a canopy of trees for 150 years, well preserved. So if you get a chance, by the way, Johnsonville's about a 2-hour drive up the river. It's worth the drive on a Saturday to go up there. This time of year especially, because you can see the terrain with the
Yeah.
trees down. So we're very fortunate. This is what I was excited about. This is what I've been referencing before I go back to the battle. Jacob Cooney was a photographer. He was a protege of George Bernard. So as Civil War historians, y'all might be familiar with Bernard. Bernard took all the photographs generally that you always see of Nashville and Atlanta during the Civil War. His protege was this guy, Jacob Cooney. Cooney was assigned by Bernard to get on one of his rail cars, and they all worked, by the way, for Montgomery Meigs, who's the quartermaster general. So the quartermaster general paid all the photographers that you see. Brady, they all worked for Brady at one time in Virginia. After the panic of 1857, they all go from three-dimensional painters to the more popular art form of the time, which was daguerreotype photography, which was producing glass plates. We are incredibly fortunate at Johnsonville to have 5 existing photographs of the place. There's probably more, I'm sure, that Cooney took that day that he was there. We do know that he showed up there on November 23rd, 1864. The battle takes place November the 4th. So he shows up 2.5 weeks right after the battle and takes the photos I'm about to show you. I'm going to show you some before and after pictures of each one. Number 1, talking about some of that board lumber. These are some probably administrative buildings. Thank goodness for digital photography, you can enhance these so much. I mean, these are like 6,000 DPI if you go on the Library of Congress's website. You can scale those up so large that you can see men inside the buildings. It's just unreal. I wasn't quite sure what this was at first, but it turned out being a barrack, because between the windows, there's these loopholes where the shutters could be closed, and if they were attacked, they can stick their muskets through those holes and fire at the enemy. And I started looking at all these buildings very closely. You could see loopholes in every one of them, which tells me, what's the biggest news event of 1864 in the Western Theater? It's Fort Pillow. So you've got, look what you've got here. You've got black troops inside the compound. This thing has dominated headlines for 7 months up to this point. I'm guessing that Thompson or whoever was in charge before he got there, there was a number of people said that, hey, if we're going to be attacked, whether they attack us from the land side or the river side, we're going to be prepared, because we're not going to let what unfolded just up the river. You see a lot of protection. You see there's a guy standing on the wall right here. He's wearing a poncho.
Yeah, way up there.
He's standing on top of the wall of the lower redoubt. You go to Johnsonville today, that's what it looks like. Still there. Go back real quick. So if you see this, I tried to stand on the exact location. If you see this hill,
Yeah.
that's why, now you know why I needed my clicker.
Yeah.
I get a lot of exercise. There's that hill right there.
Wow.
That's number 1. The second photograph, which is my favorite, this tells a lot. If you look in the background, that's the only known existing photograph of Civil War era Johnsonville. Cooney has his tripod up here. Here's the railroad berm, the upper berm. He's up here with his team. Before he shot that first photograph looking this direction. Looks like right here, he turned it back and shot the town. So what you have is a civilian town that's built up around the military depot. So if you've been, for example, I grew up near probably Fort Campbell, it's closest to me, near Clarksville. Same thing's going on there. You got a federal military compound, and you got the town of Clarksville just outside its border. Well, civilians in Clarksville are working for the Army inside the compound. The same thing's going on here. You have locals, you have local people, all of which Humphreys County was 99% Confederate. So they've got Confederate ancestors that are fighting for the Confederacy, but they've gone to work as civilians for these federal soldiers inside the compound. So they're hearing all the, talk about a spy network, right? They're hearing all the information that goes on in there with these civilian quartermaster department employees. Talk about photographs that speak 1,000 words. You can see all the charred trees here. We do know that fires swept across the depot and burned most of the buildings, which probably explains why the shake roofs have been burned off and they're temporarily putting tarps over for protection. All these black dots that you see out here, I was kind of, I took my magnifying glass and looked at everything. But all those little black specks that you see are shoes. And that, and that says a lot too. Confederates were in such need for shoes. Gettysburg, all those stories. That this Union war machine that I was talking about earlier was so grand that if a few brogans, a few shoes just fell off as they were loading the cars, who cares? We've got thousands more to go through. So that just kind of tells you a lot about this operation, how quickly and rapidly they were moving supplies to Nashville. So the way this would work, supplies would come down from St. Louis and Cincinnati to Paducah. They would be received at Paducah, which is why the Mazeppa went by Paris Landing, and then they would eventually end up at Johnsonville. So you've got the St. Louis Arsenal, you've got the Louisville Arsenal, all of those supplies in the Cincinnati Arsenal coming down to Paducah. From Paducah, which is the central distribution point, they would filter out to either Nashville or Johnsonville on the Tennessee River. Eventually, of course, before the Union Navy disrupted it, there were plans to get those supplies to Decatur via Muscle Shoals. That was before the Union Navy took charge of the river. So
The Cumberland wasn't navigable?
it was, which is one of the reasons Johnsonville is constructed, because the Union commanders that summer of 1863 realized that the Cumberland became so shallow due to a drought that year that they were afraid they couldn't get these deep draft vessels up the Cumberland River because the wharf was so steep and the river was so low that they couldn't get the supplies.
The Harper Shoals was just.
And the Harper Shoals was another one.
Yes, very.
So that's one of the reasons, driving forces about why Johnsonville ends up. It's a quick fix for a problem that they've got in Nashville. So what they did was construct this railroad 78 miles out of downtown Nashville to connect to the Tennessee River. So putting all this together now.
Now, some of the shoes came here.
Pardon me?
Some of the shoes from there came here.
You're getting to that. Tell them you're getting to that.
I don't know if I was getting to that or not.
Yeah,
That's a
you're
pretty
getting-
good fact.
You're getting to that.
I just want to make sure in case you didn't.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
so.
Once you fit it in.
So when you come to the park, what you're looking at there, that's what it looks like today. That's a Civil War era map. So this is the third photo that Cooney took. This is a double roof transfer warehouse. There was another warehouse. I'm going to get a pointer, I promise.
Yes, so you could use one. I'd like to find a big stick back there.
So picture this together. Here's the river. The Battle of Johnsonville, the Confederates were on this side of the river. So they eventually made it from Paris Landing to set up across the Tennessee River right here. They would attack the depot from the western shoreline, this way. So when I get to that, they're en route now. All the stuff's taken. They've left Paris Landing. The Confederates are en route that 40 miles. That takes them 4 days to go 40 miles because of the muddy roads and the weather. So as you enter Johnsonville, there was a blockhouse on top of a hill. the blockhouse is not there, but the foundations are still there. The track would go to 2 tracks as you came in. The northern track would spur around to a smaller warehouse building, and the southern track would spur around to that double transfer warehouse photo that I just showed you. So it looks like that. As the trains came in to load up, you can see some of the cars right there that would back down. And this is a chute that goes underneath the building out to the water. And through a system of pulleys, steam-powered pulley system, cables would come up underneath the building, pulling the supplies up the wharf into the warehouses.
Huh.
So as the trains backed against the edge of the warehouse big doors, these men would spend 12, 14, 16 hours a day loading these rail cars up to be carried all those supplies back to Nashville.
Wow.
And keep in mind, every bit of these supplies are going to supply Sherman's army operating in Georgia at this time. So this is his lifeline. It's all going on behind the lines that Force is about to have a very happy day. That's what it looks like today. So that area that I was talking about that you can wade out into is this part. It's real shallow. If you look in the photo, see the dark water? That's the river channel.
Yeah.
That warehouse set right here. You can see
That double one that you just showed?
TVA controls the water every November. They lower the waters. Y'all know that story. And every November it exposes the foundation stones to that warehouse building. You can see them just sitting out there on the edge of the river. It was always,
So if that building was still up today, it'd probably be half in the water, another half sticking out probably.
probably so, yeah. We do know that that double warehouse building was the length of 2 football fields, 200 yards long. It's a huge, massive structure. So think about all the board lumber used to construct that one warehouse, and if you look at it real close, it was a shake roof. It was a wooden shake roof. So, you know, it's hard enough to roof my 1,500 square foot house with asphalt shingles. Imagine riving out, you know, with a froe and a mallet, every one of those shakes that went on those warehouse buildings. My summation is that there ended up being about 180 buildings constructed at Johnsonville. So Cooney turns his camera back toward the lower redoubt on top of the hill and shoots what I think is one of the most telling photos of what the depot looked like. Keep in mind, this is being taken in the Western Theater late in the war. I mean, you're not seeing a lot of photographs being taken at all at this stage in the war, especially, you know, the only thing that's being taken that I've seen are those shots around the Capitol in Nashville and in Atlanta.
Yeah.
I've been looking at Civil War books since I've been 4 years old, and I've never seen anything else unless it's in a private collection. This is the sawmill number 1. It was located directly right in the middle of the depot, and as you enhance that plate, I enhanced that for the slide. Wish there was a stick or something. Here's the sawmill. There's a man standing right here. There's another one right there, like they're receiving boards as they're coming through the saw blades. You can see all the felled timber on top, just below the fort. And then all these are barracks and administrative buildings to house the garrison. Okay, so that view right there, thought I'd throw a winter shot in there. That's what it looks like today. And then you can still walk out. I mean, they've just been there 150 years. You can just walk right off the parking lot, right down the bank, and the railroad tracks from the Civil War are still there. You can just walk right out into the lake on them.
Wow.
And what ended up being the cover of my book, which is the most iconic picture taken of Johnsonville. I'm sure y'all have seen this in the pictorial history of the Civil War. The way that Cooney framed this is just amazing. This is Trace Creek coming into the Tennessee River. And that's also what I think one of the only existing photographs, Civil War era photographs of the Tennessee River. You see the ones down in Chattanooga, but you don't see anything further west than that. How the Tennessee loops around. So that's showing a Civil War era Tennessee River, which shows you before the lake was created, you can see how close the riverbank, the western riverbank was. But you got a lot going on here. Here's one of the main loading ramps. These are African-American troops up front. That's a white officer right there that turned back and looked at the camera. Like I said, you can blow these photographs up, and I challenge all of you to go on the website and look at these. You can just see so much detail. These are the unlimbered cannon of the 2nd U.S. Colored Heavy Light Artillery.
Sorry, but this is a big stick, that's about the
Even better.
You can beat somebody, oh, excuse me, you can beat somebody with that.
It makes me pretend I might have a rifle in my hand now.
Yeah, so you can defend yourself.
Okay. So there's what it looks like today. The knob across the river over there is called Pilot Knob. That's an aerial photograph of Johnsonville taken in 1937 before they flooded the river to make the Kentucky Reservoir. As Forrest came down from Paris Landing, they would have come over here, they would have had all this natural levee that you see here. In 1864, this would have been all woods. You can see now, progressing up to 1937, farmers have cleared this bottom land for farming, but in 1864, every bit of this was heavily wooded. You can clearly see some of the existing federal buildings in 1937. That's one of the barracks buildings that still exist right here. The town of Johnsonville would eventually build up even greater than the photo I just showed you. And then you can see the southern spur going this way, and you can clearly see the northern spur that's still there being used, 80 years after the war. And right here would be warehouse number 1, and then the big one over here. And most of the Civil War boat wrecks are sitting right out here. There's 6 that are still there today.
What about the state conservation effort to try to salvage those wrecks out there, like other places?
Let me.
That consigned is too expensive of an operation, or either there, I guess.
There's how, and I'll answer your question in just a sec because I'm heading that direction.
Okay.
That's a model of what a turntable is. So Johnsonville has one of the only known Civil War era turntables of any site, and it's still out there. You walk just off the main road about 100 yards into the woods, and here it is.
Wow. Wow.
See, it's round. Now, when the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railroad took over the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad about 1890, they built this bed up over this other half of the round circle. But the further back y'all are, like you are right now, you can clearly see right here there would have been an elevated arm. I'll use this. It turned like this.
Oh, yeah.
And those trains would just gear back up onto the tracks and head back to Nashville full of supplies. That brace in the middle, this is pig iron. There's big, huge, giant screws that held the arm. And of course, all those mechanics have been disappeared. Keep in mind, after the Civil War, Johnsonville became a thriving town all the way up until 1944 when TVA flooded the Tennessee River. And like so many of these river towns, it was underwater. That's why today there's a new Johnsonville, Tennessee.
That's what I was gonna ask you, because I keep seeing like 2 different Johnsonvilles.
Right.
I wondered about that.
Basically, when they flooded the town, all the white areas of town were flooded, where all the cemeteries were, so those were reinterred on the hills where the forts are today. All the black cemeteries that were there are still intact. But this area, the Civil War part of the town that became the park in the 1960s, is still intact. Johnsonville is about 60% intact. Okay, so we're just about out of time, but I want to save enough to get down here to the battle real quick. Without giving you guys too many spoilers, because like I said, I want you to read it in the book. The day before, by the way, this came out of the ORs. That's a Civil War era drawing by Leroy Fitch. It's a fantastic map. You can see Johnsonville up on your left, upper left. So, Paducah is north this way.
Yeah.
So as Fitch's flotilla came to the rescue, they came up on this island in the middle of the river called Reynoldsburg Island. The Confederates, under Morton, had placed themselves in what was called the chute. All the riverboat men of that era in the Tennessee River knew that when you got to Johnsonville, and prior to that, the town that was there was called Reynoldsburg. It's one of the earliest towns in Tennessee, which was still there, right there. But this was called Reynoldsburg Island. Every riverboat captain on the Tennessee River knew about the shoals at Reynoldsburg Island. The average depth of the chute was 10 feet. So when Fitch got here, they hold up right at the northern end of the island and start bombarding the Confederates on this side of the river. So they really give the Confederate gunners a real shellacking. But the Confederates are really dug in to the bank of the levee, of the steep levee of the Tennessee River. While they're wasting all of that ammunition down here, Morton leaves 2 guns to shoot back at them. In the meantime, Forrest orders all of his troops 4 more miles downriver to set up across for an attack on Johnsonville on the next day, November the 4th. So you've got the Battle of Reynoldsburg Island that's happening here, which is a very heated battle on November the 3rd and the morning of the 4th. This is another feint movement. This is a diversion to allow Forrest's main force to get down here, dig in, and prepare for a bigger attack on the Johnsonville depot. Maybe that's what it looks like. That's an artist's depiction. I think they were much more concealed.
Yeah.
So you had 5 batteries. It included 4 3-inch Rodmans, 4 12-pound howitzers, 2 James rifles, 2 10-pound Parrott rifles, and they're all strategically placed in 5 positions separated from about 100 yards apart. Spotted in between there were Chalmers and Buford's infantrymen. So you had Forrest's entire 3,100 man force 350 yards across the river, and supposedly the stories that I was reading prior to writing the book is that the Union soldiers on the opposite side of the river were completely surprised. They had no idea they were over there. As it turns out, that was untrue. I uncovered all that. They very much knew Forrest was in the vicinity, so much that their scouts even thought that he was going to somehow ford the Tennessee River at the Reynoldsburg Island. Forrest, I don't think, he was more shrewd to risk that move, to expose his whole force out in the middle of the river with gunboats. So that was never part of the plan. They were never going to ford the river, but Thompson was scared that if that happened, Forrest would take Johnsonville from the rear and they'd have another Fort Pillow, because you had black troops in there.
Yeah.
So Thompson was shooting off telegraphs to Thomas in Nashville saying, we need reinforcements, we need assistance fast. We're about to be attacked, Forrest is on our border, he's right on the peripheral. This is really bad. He's sending these just panicky telegrams to Thomas's telegraph office. So Union gunners are positioned in the fort by the way, that's what Fort Johnson looks like today. Manning those guns are the white gunners of the 1st Kansas Artillery and the black gunners of the 2nd U.S. Colored Light Artillery. There's 6 guns actually in the fort. 3 of those guns are facing the opposite direction on the wooded side of the compound, and only 3 guns are facing in the direction of the river at that time. Both sides have Parrott guns. So at 2 p.m., without giving you any spoilers that's in the book, Forrest tells all of his commanders to synchronize their watches, and at exactly 2 p.m., the assault would take place. There's very few casualties in this battle because it's fought over 300 yards of water. It's not like opposing forces on the fields at Shiloh where they're right in each other's faces. So the second reason there's very few casualties out of the Battle of Johnsonville is because the Confederates are so well dug in on the levee on the western shoreline. So much so that the elevation of the fort across the river was too high, which meant most of their shots overshot the Confederates that were pushed up right on the levee. So they'd spent the night before digging these chambers for their guns in the natural levee of the river. So if you can picture that, well, y'all seen the Tennessee River. Yeah. The natural levee is just a, by nature, built up dirt mound just through the course of the water that's pushed this kind of hill-type round earthwork. When the Confederates got there, they spent that night with shovels and picks digging ramparts in the middle of that wall that allowed them just enough to put their guns through that space. To elevate them, to hit the fort, they would dig chambers so the trail of the gun, the back part of the gun, could be lowered so the barrel could get the elevation to hit the gunners in the fort.
Almost like a mortar.
Just like, basically doing it just like a mortar, yes. So from 2 to 5, pure chaos, just absolutely. I mean, Forrest even said in that memoir that it was the most terrific firing he'd ever heard, ever. And I mean, think about it. Forrest had been in some major battles. He had heard the gunboats, the 2 gunboats at Shiloh. He'd experienced everything. And to say that the firing was the most terrific I'd ever heard, what he ended up referring to is that on the wharf, you got to remember the Federals had 3 of the 4 gunboats left. The Undine had been captured and burned just downriver, and the Venus had been recaptured. The Venus was already back at Johnsonville at that point. So you've got almost 50 to 60 of these timber-clad mounted guns that enfilade right in the middle of the Tennessee River and turned their guns, everything Forrest had feared, into those positions, and really started giving the Confederates a shellacking on that side of the river. The Confederates they're able to make most of their achievements by hitting the warehouses. One of the warehouses, the smaller one, catches a fire, burns up, consumes everything inside, with a number of other buildings in the depot. Men are running everywhere. There's women inside there. There's shimmying up the hill to the fort. If you want to read a comical account, look at Morton's account of this battle. He's describing all of this. Whiskey barrels rolling down into the river on fire and catching on fire. It's quite a scene, I would think.
So the King was at Johnsonville on one of those gunboats, correct?
Correct.
Did he have anything to do with setting the gunboats on fire?
So, the night before, I told you this could be a 4-hour conversation.
Sure.
But the night before, King gets together with Thompson and the chief quartermaster of the place, his name is Henry Helen. They agreed that, they were thinking Forrest was going to come around and take Johnsonville from the land side. And if that happened, they did not want the gunboats to fall into the hands of the Confederates. So they all agreed out of that meeting that if that were to happen, the gunboats would be set afire.
Okay. So
Now-
King was privy to that, making that.
Well, now what happens is there's 26 vessels docked at the wharf that morning. So there's only 3 gunboats there, and most of them are transport boats, and there's a number of barges as well.
Right.
So these barges, which were generally pulled behind the transport boats, just packed with supplies. During the middle of this battle, Helen gives some of these sailors to go on board the boats and start setting them afire. All of them.
Not King, Helen.
King's in his flagship in the Key West, out in the middle of the channel, firing back at the Confederates. So Howland's left in charge. He orders men to go onto these boats with torches and start setting these magnificent, in Nashville we've got the General Jackson, that plies the Cumberland River.
Right.
That's the only thing I can use as a reference point for y'all. But I can't imagine, and there's even accounts that I uncovered of Confederates on the opposite side of the river screaming back at the Union sailors, or whoever they were, setting fire, screaming at them, telling them, "Don't set these beautiful boats on fire. Please don't." They're screaming across the river. And Morton accounts for that a lot. He's saying that we couldn't believe our eyes. They're setting their own boats on fire. The wind was up that day. The worst disaster that you can possibly imagine happens, and the wind catches the next boat on fire, and just like a chain reaction all the way up the wharf,
The conflagration.
it sets these seasoned timber boats, packet boats, some of them 290, 300 tons on the edge of the wharf. All the fire spreads, burns every boat on the wharf. That fire makes it up into the buildings and eventually blows its way across the depot. And that is why Forrest says that on the evening of the 4th, the majority of my command retreated south to Perryville under the light of the burning depot at Johnsonville. So they're withdrawing to the light created by this massive inferno that takes place. In the meantime, Thompson has lost his nerve. He's frantically, sending telegraphs to Thomas in Nashville saying, "Oh my God, it's just pure chaos," which it was. The Confederates the next morning continue their fire. Rucker's brigade is left with 2 batteries under Thrall's battery, and they resume the battle at 7 a.m. on the 5th. So it's a 2-day battle, and they spend the majority of the day bombing, shelling the town of Johnsonville. A number of civilians are killed, a number of soldiers are killed. There's about 40 casualties out of this whole battle. Only 2 Confederates are killed. The rest of them are on the Federal side. So he withdraws to the town of Perryville. Those boats that you were asking about. So here's the location of the warehouse number 1 today. I showed you the earlier photograph of warehouse 2. Right here, in about 15 feet of water, sits the USS Elfin, and right over here, burned to its side, is the USS Tarleton. Those boats are completely, from the floor decks below, are completely intact.
Wow.
During the archaeological dives, we conducted 4 from 2008, 2007 to 2012, and the divers couldn't really get into the cargo holds because in the 1910s and 20s, the Corps of Engineers, as y'all know, dredged the Tennessee River. And in doing so, all the upper casing of those boats, which included a lot of iron and metal, they were pushed off and dredged, and a lot of that stuff was pushed to the side. So the X-ray photos that we have that show the boat wrecks, you can clearly see a lot of debris on top of the decks that are just pushed down. It's really dangerous for divers to be there. They did cut a significant hole in the deck of the Elfin and recovered a significant number of artifacts that are on display at the museum. Unfortunately, I say unfortunately because it is, the United States Navy owns any inland river wreck in the United States.
Oh.
So whether it's a Civil War wreck or a modern day wreck, the Navy owns those wrecks. And they have a holding repository in Maryland where all the historic artifacts, whether it's Civil War or any other events, go. It's a warehouse full of stuff. I got a chance to go up there and I got to see the Johnsonville stuff. But it's but they have curators that curate that, and we were able to get a significant amount when I was manager there that come back that are on display. But it does kind of, and this is ending my presentation here shortly, but it does kind of account for civilians in Johnsonville who later grew up there and stayed there in the 1920s and 30s. Talked about as kids, we used to go out onto the gunboats and play because, when the river was down, all those wrecks were exposed. And if you want to see a great photo, look at a 1905 version of Confederate Veteran magazine. I think it's the June version. And it says wrecks at Johnsonville. It shows these wrecks sitting out there. And they're the Civil War era boats.
Wow.
And you can clearly see the guts of the inside of the boats. So there's the Union losses. When I did this slide, I discovered it was actually greater, it was near 8 million. But you can see about 150 Union prisoners. Most of those were taken at the Paris Landing area of the campaign. But look at that, 17 barges, 14 transport boats, 4 gunboats. This is why this is considered Forrest's greatest raid of the war.
Yeah.
Confederate losses, 2 men killed, 9 wounded. Schofield is dispatched. This is the same John Schofield that holds the Carter House. He comes there with 2 brigades on the 2 days later, on the 6th of November, he shows up. And they begin reconstructing a second redoubt, which is on top of the hill called the Upper Redoubt. That's one of the larger fort that I showed you. And also they went across the river and cut all the timber on that side of the river so the Confederates, if they were to make another attack like that, they couldn't use that concealment to make the attack. By the way, I always say, this is our tie. This is, when you talk about the Middle Tennessee campaign of 1864, you always hear, Spring Hill, Franklin, Nashville.
Yeah.
Well, it really began at Johnsonville.
Mm-hmm.
So the Middle Tennessee campaign of the fall of 1864 begins with Johnsonville, because Schofield leaves Johnsonville with those 2 brigades, Orlando Cox's brigade and help me out, Civil War historians. Who's the other one right there? No. Moore and Cox.
Yeah.
So they leave Johnsonville, and they're the ones that take position right at the Carter House. So there's, so they're pulled out of Johnsonville to go defend that area.
I forgot they had
So
5 cavalry regiments.
Well, they end up at Columbia before they get to Franklin.
Yeah, so they go to Columbia,
Then to Franklin.
then they're Spring Hill and all that, and then they end up at Franklin. But eventually, they end up there at the gut of the Carter House.
And the whole time Thomas is a nervous wreck because he's trying to figure out what Hood's going to do and whether he's got the leadership and everything in Pulaski and it's,
Right, it's a mess.
Well, there's a big concern that, matter of fact, Rutger did cross the river, but there was a big concern, that Forrest would cross the river. Of course, Forrest didn't, if you read stuff, Forrest really didn't know Hood was at most of the shows.
Right.
He thought Hood, he didn't even know Hood was there. That's one of the debacles of Hood's campaign, was Forrest found out he was supposed to be at most shows at the very end of Johnsonville.
But you thought it might have been in Decatur, didn't it, Greg?
Well, he didn't even know, when Taylor sent Forrest north,
Yeah.
Beauregard had told Taylor that Hood's crossing at Gunnersville, because that's what Hood had told him.
Yeah.
And then he ends up at Decatur, and then all of a sudden, Beauregard finds out he's heading to Tuscaloosa, and then he gets up there, and they really don't send an order to Forrest till November 2nd. So it's a, you know, that's a very convoluted story about the failure of logistics on Hood's part on setting up the whole campaign.
But you're right about Johnsonville being a part of that one deal.
It really is, and you know, it's just, it's been left out of that entire historiography.
Yeah, so you missed the story about the boots, and so he's gonna tell you what it is, so tell him.
When Forrest
Let me, hold on, let me wrap, I got 2 more slides, let me get this wrapped up, and then we're gonna have some questions and answers.
We saw that list of boots and contraband.
So Thomas orders Johnsonville abandoned on the 26th, and on the 30th, the same day as Franklin's unfolding, the final train of stores leaves Franklin, so it's completely abandoned. So this millions of dollars of buildings, railroad construction, kind of sounds like the Howard Hughes story of delivering the planes after the war ends. You know, all this government spending to construct the railroad, to build the wharf, to build the depot, the compound, to defend it, all is for naught because of eventually what happens with Hood moving into Middle Tennessee. So the results, of course, as I mentioned earlier, was a tactical victory. Strategically, though, the victory had little effect against Sherman's war machine. Johnsonville Supply Depot was almost completely destroyed on November 4th and 5th. The aftermath, of course, the Confederates' 2-week-long campaign not only resulted in the near completion of Johnsonville, it rendered that railroad useless. And the loss of that base left Thomas and Nashville doubtful of the future use of the Tennessee River as a supply base, even more importantly. And there you go. This is directly out of the ORs. As the rebels have destroyed our base of supplies, they, meaning the citizens themselves, and the rebel citizens, must furnish our subsistence. You will bear the brunt of the after effects. What he meant by that is him taking off out of Atlanta towards Savannah. And he would do that a week after he wrote that